Hi, everyone. My name is Sam Olson, and I'm an occupational therapist from Persist Therapy. And I am here today in partnership with Cultivate Mankato to talk about sensory integration and modulation. And so I am going to be talking about sensory play every day in the classroom. Right. So just to run over our objectives for today's presentation real quick. I hope that everyone leaves today's presentation having a better understanding of what sensory processing is. I hope that everyone is able to name all the 8 different sensory systems. Yes, there are 8. Gain a better understanding of how sensory impacts our everyday responses and how behavior may sometimes look like sensory. Identify ways to integrate sensory into everyday activities for young children in your classroom, and learn language and communication skills to help promote and facilitate sensory processing in your class. All right. So, like I said, we're going to be focusing on sensory today, but I think it's important to also talk about what exactly occupational therapy is and what we do. So I want to spend just a few minutes talking about that before we dive right into the sensory piece of things. So yes, as an occupational therapist, sensory is a large part of what we do as far as pediatrics, but it's not everything that we do. And so what we want to help children do is to find their independence with everyday activities. And so we want to make sure that children are functioning at their best with things that they need to do that are appropriate for their developmental level. And this looks different for each child depending on their specific abilities, and obviously differs as children go through different stages as well. So with babies, some developmental milestones that you might think of, and developmental milestones are when we're finding independence and finding function in our everyday life. So that's kind of how you can think about independence, as meeting developmental milestones. So babies are kind of their easiest to think about. And when we're thinking about babies, we are thinking about crawling and walking and rolling and sitting up. But developmental milestones expand way beyond 18 months of age. And as children get older, these developmental milestones become dressing, toileting, social skills, regulation, sleep, motor skills, just to name a few. So those are things that we want kids to gain independence with. And when kids aren't meeting milestones consistently, there becomes a breakdown within their everyday activities because of this. And that's when we want occupational therapy to be involved in the child's care. So when it comes down to it, to me, occupational therapy is all about independence, empowerment, teaching children to advocate for their specific needs, and ensuring that we are creating meaning and fulfillment and quality of life in a child's life. So when we think about all of these areas in independence and function, everything is very connected. It's very intertwined. And so I just want to give an example to really bring that point home. Something that I think we can all relate to is children that are picky eaters. And so here's what all breaks down when picky eating is involved, right? So if a child is not eating or not eating well, a lot of times malnutrition or just nutrition in general can come into play. And when kids aren't nourished appropriately, it makes it impossible to regulate because that's really at the foundational level. And so if a child can't regulate because they're not eating, they're having trouble managing everything. Now, in addition to that, if they're not regulated, they're probably not able to socially connect with their peers and their teachers. And so now social skills start to break down because of this as well. And if a child isn't eating, they're probably not using utensils either. And so now we have a social breakdown, a coordination or motor breakdown, and also that regulation problem because they're not eating well. And then, of course, picky eating comes back to being a sensory thing as well. So in this one example, picky eating, we can see how all of these things are really interconnected and how they all start to play a role in breakdown and not meeting those developmental milestones. And so it's super important when you see those things and when it really starts to become a consistency and impact a child's everyday life and ability to meet their milestones, that we get occupational therapy on board. I also wanted to take a few minutes to talk about Persist Therapy's partnership with Cultivate. So currently, when this presentation was made in September of 2022, I am on site at Cultivate typically every Friday. And so what I do in my partnership with Cultivate really depends on and differs on a week-to-week basis. I will come in and screen kids that there might be concerns about. So if you have anyone that you have concerns about or that may have some delay in your classroom, make sure that you're talking to the lead teacher about that or the specialist. And the specialist will bring it to Laura, and then we'll determine what's the next step here. Do we need to look at doing a screening? And that would just be where I come in, talk to the teachers, maybe work with the child a little bit and determine what are the next steps here. Do we want to get therapy involved? And that does not always mean Persist Therapy involved. That generally means getting Help Me Grow involved first, and then just seeing if there are any needs with that as well. So I'm coming in doing screenings with different kids. We've been doing a lot of sensory work. This presentation, we're going to be working on getting sensory toolkits set up in the classroom as well. And we'll continue to grow and expand in our partnership as well. But ultimately, I really hope that I get to come in and collaborate with teachers and the team in general to figure out how we can best serve and meet the needs of the children at Cultivate. And then, of course, doing partnerships. Part of partnership is creating presentations like this one today. I want to take time to really emphasize how important it is for early educators like yourself and occupational therapists to partner. I think that a lot of times children are getting missed, and this quote that we'll read actually will speak to that a little bit as well, but children in early intervention are getting missed. And as far as if they're delayed or need a little bit of therapy assistance, and unfortunately, what begins to happen when we miss those things is that habits start to form that may not necessarily have the best tools or use of skills. And when those habits form, that also creates brain pathways, right? And so when kids get to therapy much later in life, we really have to work to create new habits by teaching new skills, and then really work to make brain change as well. And unfortunately, that takes a really long time. So the quicker that we can get to children and make sure that we're meeting their needs and that they're not falling behind developmentally, the less work that we'll have to do in the future. I work with a lot of teens, and their parents always say, like, oh my goodness, I wish that we would have caught this earlier on, or oh, why didn't someone catch this and we wouldn't have to be working so hard now. So your role is so important. In addition to my partnership with Cultivate, I also work one-on-one directly with children. And that's when parents and caregivers directly hire me to work with their kids separately on more of that one-to-one and in the classroom basis. So that might be another role that you see me providing when I'm at Cultivate. So, all right, before we jump into the next thing, I just want to read this quote to you. Among infants and toddlers with developmental delay or disability receiving care in a safety net health system, only 18.7% were early intervention referred, and only 26.3% of those early intervention referred children accessed care. So I thought this quote was so important. It really hit home for me. And it emphasizes the importance of making sure that if we have concerns that we are doing a screen, there is no harm in doing a quick screen and making sure that we're getting kids the services that they need so that developmentally things aren't breaking down for them as they continue to go on. So I just wanted to share that with you because you do play such a critical role in making sure that services start. So I thank you for your partnership with that. All right, let's go ahead and get into the presentation. So we are going to be breaking today's presentation down into 4 different parts. We're going to first be starting off with sensory basics. Then we're going to talk a little bit specifically about sensory integration and modulation. And then we'll end within this presentation talking about just how to incorporate daily sensory into your classroom on an everyday basis. And then we will have breakout sessions for preschool, and that's going to focus on sensory breaks. And then we'll be talking about specific sensory for infants and toddlers in that breakout session. So we're going to start with sensory basics, and here are the questions that I hope to answer with this section. So what is sensory? What are the different areas of sensory? I'm sure we can all think back to elementary school and think of those 5 basic sensory systems, but in the occupational therapy world, there are actually 8 sensory systems. So we'll talk about that. What are different sensory responses that we might see? And then one of my favorite sayings, sensory is behavior and behavior is sensory. And what exactly does that mean? And how do we work with that? All right, so we are going to start with those 8 sensory systems that we just discussed. So the picture on the screen is the motor homunculus. It's part of our brain. And so it's just how you can think of how these sensory areas in different parts of our body are represented in our brain. And then also how much sensory information is giving to those different parts. So you can see that tactily, hands, touch is huge. Also oral, tongue, that's huge as well. So big sensory systems there. Okay, so our 8 sensory systems, visual, seeing, auditory, which is hearing. Then we have olfactory, which is smell, and gustatory, which is taste. Those are probably, and then tactile is touching or feeling. So those are probably the 5 that everyone is most familiar with and that you usually spend time talking about and discovering in those early years. But then in the OT world, we also have vestibular and proprioceptive, which are more movement-based sensory. And vestibular is our sense of movement and balance in space. So it's how we move through space, how we're able to maintain our balance. It contributes a lot to that midline crossing and also hand dominance that we talk about so much in those later years. And that can really contribute to reading and writing difficulties. And then proprioception too. And that is where our body is in space, being able to figure out where we in relationship to other objects and other things in space. A lot of times you can kind of think about perhaps some clumsiness when you think of proprioception, or, on the opposite end of the spectrum being very athletically gifted or motor gifted. So, and then the last sense is interoception. There's a lot of research in the OT world going on right now about interoception. And that's how we internally sense and internally feel things. So we can think of it as more of an organ-based sensation. So temperature, hunger, thirst, even pain, all contribute to interoception. So then we are going to move on to talking about the different sensory profiles. So on the picture on the screen here is a nosology for sensory processing disorder that is put out by the STAR Institute. The STAR Institute is kind of the gold standard when you think of sensory integration and modulation. If you go in to do a specialty certification in sensory, they are where you get that certification. And why I wanted to bring this up today is because we're actually going to be covering just a small part of sensory processing disorder today, and that's that sensory modulation disorder piece of things. And so, as you can see, we're not even going to be discussing sensory-based motor disorder and sensory discrimination disorder. So sensory is huge, and it's very complex. It's hard to talk about and hard to educate about because it is such a big piece, and it's very complex. And unfortunately, within the last few years, I think that sensory has gotten really oversimplified or almost generalized. You know, people hear sensory and they think weighted blankets and tags and clothes, but it's so much more than that. And I think it's important that we appreciate and respect the complexity of the sensory system, because we can actually do children and people in general a huge disservice when we really oversimplify it. So when we're talking about the different sensory profiles, I really want to emphasize that there is no sensory profile that is right or wrong or good or bad, or that you want to work towards. Our goal is never to change a sensory profile. That's very foundational. It's at our foundational level. It really makes up who we are and how we respond to things. So as an occupational therapist, when I go in to work with someone, I don't want to change someone's sensory system. My goal is rather to really educate and empower people to better understand their sensory profile and their sensory system so that they can feel more comfortable in the world around them. So everyone has a sensory system. Everyone has a very specific sensory profile. And when we can help people to better understand their sensory needs and give them tools and support and resources to meet their sensory needs, they can begin to feel better in their sensory environment. So how we determine someone's sensory profile is an occupational therapist would come in and actually do a sensory assessment that asks a bunch of questions so that we can really better understand sensory related responses. And then that's how we begin the assessment, and the observation is how we begin working with someone on that. If someone has difficulty modulating and integrating sensory information that's coming in from their environment, the diagnosis that typically goes with that is sensory processing disorder. And that's the nosology that you see in the picture. So as far as sensory profiles go, in sensory modulation disorder, there are really three profiles. So we have sensory overresponsivity or sensory overresponsive, and that's when an environment is just too much. It's, our bodies are telling us, whoa, too much. I can't take in all of this information. Then we also have sensory underresponsive profiles, and that's when the environment just isn't enough. So it's not enough to alert or arouse our sensory system to be able to respond to it. And then we also have craving, and that's when we just can't get enough. We want more and more. Our body is craving and seeking out a specific sensory response or sensory information, I should say. So before we move on, I want to take a minute to pause and reflect for you to think about your own sensory system. I'm sure as I was going and talking about the different sensory profiles, you might have been thinking about or picturing a child that you've worked with in the past in your mind. But I want you to take a minute to actually think about your own sensory profile. So where do you find yourself on the sensory profile spectrum? So just some questions to be thinking about. So visually, how do you respond to an environment? Are environments often dark? Do you like to keep the shades down, or do you like environments to be very bright and colorful? You kind of seek out some of that visual brightness or even the darkness. From an auditory perspective, do you like to play your music really loud, or maybe you like quiet? And maybe even that response changes throughout the day, right? Maybe you feel very overwhelmed and overstimulated from your day, so you actually try to decrease the amount of auditory information in your environment. Or maybe you're the opposite, and when you're feeling really overwhelmed or overstimulated, you need that music, right? There's no right or wrong. How about even smells or chewing? Are there certain foods or even textures that you really seek out or look towards? Maybe crunchy or chewy. What about when it comes to movement? Are there certain movements that your body needs on a daily basis, or that your body really tries to get or tells you that you need? Like I said, there's no right or wrong. I've worked with a lot of adults in the past with sensory processing disorder, and I think it's so interesting to work with adults because they have more language and communication to communicate things with you. So I just wanted to share some of the things that I've worked on in the past with adults with sensory processing disorder. I worked with a client in the past, and he just stressed how frustrated he was with waking up every morning, like very upset, very crabby, just literally waking up on the wrong side of the bed. Well, we were able to determine that he was super sound sensitive, auditorily sensitive. So waking up to that annoying alarm, beep, 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 in the morning just really set his day off on the wrong foot. So we were able to easily adapt that. And I can't remember exactly what he ended up doing. I think he ended up waking up to like talk more, like talk radio type thing. And it was just interesting how that made such an impact. That small change, that small tool that now he knows is something that bothers him, how we were able to change a whole response for the day. And then I also had a client that was starting to become agoraphobic. She didn't want to leave her house at all. And ultimately, what we were able to figure out is that she was very light sensitive. So going outside into that direct sunlight, or even in stores with the different lights, or even flashing lights, was very hard for her to manage and to deal with. So when we were able to pick out some filtered glasses for her, or even wear sunglasses, even in indoor environments, this made a huge difference for her, and she no longer felt agoraphobic. So, and then I just have to share this story because I think it's so interesting. I'm a mobile therapist, right? So I'm always in my car. I was sitting at a park one day, documenting in between my therapy sessions, and all of a sudden I see this adult pull up and get out of her car and go on the swings, and she was swinging so high in the air, and I had to giggle because I thought, oh my goodness, she's doing what her sensory system needs, right? Her sensory system really needs that vestibular movement, and she is seeking that out and getting what her body needs by taking her lunch break and going to a park to swing. So I just thought that was so cool. I had to share it. So I am sure that some of you have heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And that's, just the foundational things are really at the bottom, and learning, education, cognition is really at the top. So I created my own OT lens, sensory lens kind of hierarchy of needs, and I wanted to share that with you today. Because I think it's so important to drive the point home how important sensory and regulation really are, right? They're at the bottom of that foundation. And so if we do not work hard to help our children and people in general to create strong sensory systems, it's very hard for them to regulate. And of course, if we're not regulated, then it makes it difficult to be able to learn new skills and acquire new skills. And I think that's where our jobs really intertwine and intermix, and it's so important for us to work together and to collaborate to make sure that regulation and sensory systems are where they need to be so that kids can learn the beautiful and wonderful skills that you're teaching them. So we have to make sure that if we have concerns about a child's ability to integrate and modulate their sensory system, that we're bringing in occupational therapy services to create that really strong foundation so that they are able to learn those skills. So now I wanted to talk a little bit about sensory as behavior and behavior is sensory, and what exactly does this mean? So one of my sensory mentors says this phrase, sensory is behavior and behavior is sensory. And I just love it and use it now. But this is really where I start to lose people when I'm talking about sensory. And I think that that's because as a society, we have really been taught to look at children and people through a behavioral lens. And so when we're looking at people through a behavioral lens, we're thinking more in those black and white terms, right? Good, bad, listening, not listening, right, wrong. And what I want to do today is really challenge you to start looking at kids through a sensory and regulation lens. And that means that we often have to get uncomfortable in that gray space, right? So our behavioral lens is really that black and white, and sensory is really a gray space, right? It's that space of not always knowing, not always quite being sure, not always having the answers, and being okay with it. And that often means that we have to really work as a detective to problem solve and to figure out what's at the root and what's at the why of some of these responses. So I think a great way to, if we're looking at starting to use a sensory lens, a great place to start is to really approach the situations and kids from a place of curiosity, right? So you might want to ask yourself, if a child is not listening, why aren't they listening? Is what I'm doing, is it not engaging enough for them? Or some, maybe they're understimulated, or maybe the environment is so busy, they're feeling very overstimulated by their environment, and so it's hard to be able to respond to it. And maybe they just can't focus and attend because their sensory system is just screaming at them that it's too much for them and they just can't give their attention there. Or maybe there's a child that's constantly picking fights with their classmates. If we want to use that sensory lens, we can kind of ask ourselves, why? What's at the root of this? Maybe the child's actually really clumsy. They're kind of under responsive to their environment. Or maybe they're needing more opportunity for movement. They're very under-responsive or craving. Or maybe they're even perceiving the situation incorrectly. And so, maybe there's clumsiness going all over and someone gets pushed and it's really because of incoordination and clumsiness, but the child might be super over-responsive to their environment, and they might perceive that as a threat and kind of feel like they need to fight back. So there are so many different ways to kind of look at and think about behavior from a sensory lens and perspective, and to think about, what's the reason for this, and really address the reason for it rather than the behavior itself. Maybe there's a classmate sitting next to a kid, and what they're saying They might just be talking, but maybe the peer next to them is very sound sensitive. And so to them, they're perceiving it as yelling, and that triggers kind of that fight or flight response. So there's just a lot of different ways to be thinking about it. We only know what we know, right? And so if you've always had these different sensory responses, or how you perceive your sensory environment is different from the people around you, and you're not quite sure how to work through that, you only know what you know, right? And so we might not recognize that how we're responding to sensory situations is different than other people. And of course, if you only know what you know, you don't necessarily have the language or communication to be able to tell someone what's going on. I think even as adults, we don't always understand where some of our responses are coming from. So how on earth can we expect kids to be able to communicate through that and recognize that? So just be keeping that in the back of your mind as well. Okay, so now we're gonna talk a little bit about that sensory integration and modulation piece. So our top picture is that nice river, right? We've just got gentle waves flowing on that river. And then on the bottom, we've got the up and down roller coaster, right? So if we're thinking about our kids at school, we really would like for their days to be like the top picture, right? To be, flowing and smooth. And of course, you might run into some obstacles and rocks and rapids that you might need to navigate, but you can move through them quickly, right? What we don't want to see on a consistent basis, remember, we all have our days, but if you're seeing things consistently or at a certain time of day, or there's just a pattern with it, where things are just up and down, you never know what to expect. Moods are really high or moods are really low. That's when you need to get OT involved. Because obviously if we're having these really big up and down moments consistently, it's not only exhausting for you as teachers, but also for the kids too. So we really want to work on that consistency piece. All right. So in our last slide, we talked about our waves and our roller coasters. Now, in addition to that, we all have kind of a threshold of tolerance, right? And some of us have a very high threshold. Those are our profiles that are under responsive. And then, of course, we have our low thresholds, are more over responsive, meaning that doesn't take much of the environment to get them to respond, as opposed to the higher threshold, it takes a lot in the environment to get a response, right? And like I said, there isn't a right one or a wrong one. It just is what it is. And no matter really what our threshold is, as long as we have the resources and the support and the tools to know and understand and cope with our sensory system, we can really handle whatever comes at us, right? And then if we don't have that, right, where no matter where our threshold is and we don't have the tools and the resources and the sensory supports, then days are going to continue to be really up and down and inconsistent. So we have high thresholds and low thresholds, right? But to make things even more complex, right? Sensory is very complex. Thresholds can kind of intermix, right? So maybe we have a very high auditory threshold and maybe a very low gustatory or visual threshold, right? So it can really change within the different sensory systems as well too. So that makes things even more complex. And then of course it can kind of change throughout the day too, right? As our tanks and buckets aren't as full at the end of the day because we're just exhausted from everything coming at us, our threshold might change a little bit as well. So just being aware of this and understanding that where this comes into play. So when we would want occupational therapy to get involved is when we see days like this bottom one, where days are consistently really up and down and all over the place, and we're just not really sure what to do with that anymore. Okay, so a lot of information. I hope everyone is sticking with me. You're probably all in sensory overload. That's what we're here for, to learn about it and to figure out what we can do, right? So all of this sounds great in theory, but now, of course, the question really becomes, what do we do about it, right? How do we help kids find those wave-like days, and maybe even ourselves those wave-like days? So now we're going to be talking about sensory in the classroom. Okay. So another phrase that I like to use, I think that's an OT thing, is sensory play every day. Okay. So we want to be incorporating sensory activities and sensory play into everyday classrooms. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that, and I'm going to break that down into 3 parts. And I think it's the first thing to emphasize is that everything can really be sensory. Anything can be sensory related, but we need 3 things to really be intentional about it for the body and the brain to really perceive it as sensory and really meet those sensory needs. So I want to teach you guys how to do that with these 3 concepts: awareness, intentional sensory play, and language and communication. All right. So we are going to start with awareness, because I think that's really the first step in becoming a sensory friendly provider. When we better understand our own sensory profiles and sensory needs, we can begin to better understand the sensory profiles and needs of those around us as well. So I want to clarify that this does not mean that every single child in your classroom needs a sensory assessment done, right? We can begin to observe and recognize different sensory needs, and just having that awareness to go with it, and to be able to be thinking about that, to use that sensory lens and really be the detective. That's really the most important part. So we need to have awareness and also that respect for each sensory system and sensory profile, because remember, there isn't a right or a wrong. So when we begin to look at children through more of that sensory lens, we kind of start to see them in a different light, right? So rather than looking at something from a strictly behavioral perspective, maybe they're climbing on that shelf because they're naughty or they're bad, we can start to look at them from a sensory lens. Their body is really craving a climbing activity, so let me see what I can find for them that's safe and friendly to meet that sensory need. So as we begin to start looking at children from that sensory lens and that sensory perspective, our feelings can kind of change too, right? We might, if we're looking at kids from a strictly behavioral perspective, it's easy to feel frustration and irritability and resentment. But when we start looking at children with that sensory lens, we really start to replace some of those feelings with curiosity and maybe even a little bit of empathy and compassion because of that as well. So when we're looking for sensory clues, we need to be thinking about consistency and patterns. So if something happens in isolation, we all have our days, right? Maybe we're tired, maybe we're really hungry, and so we're having a big response because of that, not necessarily a sensory-based issue. But that's, if we're seeing something that's a consistent difficulty, or it's time of the day that, there's a pattern to it, or a specific activity that is consistently difficult, that's really when we need to get occupational therapy involved. Or when we see that it's really breaking down and impacting their ability to grow and develop and to learn too. That's when we can get OT involved. So when we start to look at children from that sensory lens, we can start to help them to look at themselves in that same way and to learn things about their own sensory system, right? So we can help them to notice different patterns or different responses that they have and why they have them. So for example, if a child is really bothered by people being too close or in their space or in their bubble, we can start to help them to recognize that too and give them some tools to manage that, right? We can tell them, oh, wow, I noticed that you don't like being close to Billy. That's okay. you don't need to stand close to Billy. Why don't you go stand at the end of the line? Or maybe ask Billy to back up a little bit, that you don't like him to be so close. So we can really give them to use those tools. Or maybe we also notice that meal times are really difficult because it's too loud, or that outside time is really too stressful because they don't like to take their feet off the ground. That's called gravitational insecurity. We can help them to notice these things too, and to start finding tools and different ways to cope with those things. So the more awareness that we have of our own sensory needs and then our children's sensory needs, the more we can help to really create that strong foundation that we talked about a while back when we think about that hierarchy. All right, so now we're going to move to intentional sensory play. So I have had the privilege of being in every single classroom here, and I 100% know that you guys are doing sensory play every day and sensory activities, which is so awesome. I definitely don't see that everywhere I go. So the next step, thinking at it from my OT brain and my OT lens, is to really think about bringing intention to the sensory activity. So I want to drive this home with an example, right? So let's say a friend calls you up and asks you to go on a walk. You might be thinking of that as just a leisurely walk, right? Where we get to socialize and talk and just be together, right? Really enjoy that. Well, let's say that you get together with that friend and they say, oh, I missed my workout for the day. I really need to get some exercise. Well, now this walk kind of changes, right? Because you're not necessarily thinking about the social aspects of it. You're thinking about how long are you going? How fast are you going to walk? Your breath and your heart rate all start to increase, right? So that changes the walk. Or maybe we're even thinking about it as a sensory or a nature walk. And so we're thinking about taking in all of the sights and sounds that we see around us. And the same goes for sensory, right? So if we are making sure that we're bringing intention to a sensory activity, we're thinking about it as a purposeful and intentional sensory activity, how we treat it really changes. I want you to keep in mind that not everything you do needs to be a sensory-based activity, right? That would be a lot of planning, a lot of preparation, just a lot of brain space that you would need to take for that. It does not need to be that. But if we can just think of bringing intention to one sensory activity that we do a day, that's a great place to start. And also, you don't need to think about challenging every single sensory system. So kind of go back to those 8 sensory systems that we talk about. Just choose one sensory system that you really want to challenge, or maybe a couple, right? So I wanted to give a few examples of bringing sensory into the everyday things that you're already doing, right? So for morning meeting, maybe you can think about challenging the smells, right? So maybe you can bring the diffuser, or maybe even a spice from your own kitchen cabinet, and pass that around and have the kids smell it. You can talk about, like, what does this remind you of? Do you like it? Do you not like it? How does it make your body feel? Have you ever had anything like this or smelled anything like this, right? If we go on a walk, we can really be focusing about the sensory world and the sensory environment around the kids, right? What do they hear? What do they see? What do they smell? How does this make them feel? And you'll notice that it's different for each kid, right? Some kids really thrive in the busyness that's going on around them. And for some kids, that's a little bit more difficult to deal with. You could also talk about the different colors, the brightness, the dullness, the light, how it changes as you walk, as you go behind buildings, or as the sun goes behind the clouds. Before they have a meal, you could talk about more of that interoception, and have them think about how their throat feels. If they're feeling thirsty, is it dry? Is their mouth dry? Does it feel scratchy? What about their stomach? Does it feel full, or does it feel empty? Is it quiet, or is it making noises? And once they take their first bite, how do all of these things change? Or their first drink, how do those things change? And after they've had their meal, what changes for them? When they go outside for play, you could talk about their body. What movement is their body really craving? Do they want to jump or run or climb? Or maybe they need that vestibular input of the swing and the slide. But help them to kind of recognize what is your body asking you to do and how can you get that movement that they need. Or maybe you were noticing that they were really climbing or jumping in the classroom, so you can help them direct to those type of activities. And you can talk about when they get that movement, how do their arms feel? How do their legs feel? What is their brain doing now? Nap time, we can talk about how do we know our body is ready for sleep, right? Are we yawning? Do our eyes feel really tired and droopy? Maybe our brain feels really busy, or maybe it feels really empty. If we do music in the room, we can be intentional about the music. We could talk about how the movement's really fast to wake everyone up, or how the music is really slow to kind of slow everyone down. Maybe we can even change the volume of the music depending on if we're really wanting to alert people or if we're really wanting to calm them down, and we can make them aware of this. We can change how the music is. And like I said, as you do these different activities, you're going to notice that each child has a different response. That's their sensory system. That's their sensory profile coming out. And we get to notice and see all of their unique differences with this and really better understand and respect them. I want to make sure, I really hope that in talking about all of this, it's not stressing you out. I don't want you to think that you have to come up with these big, elaborate, and huge sensory plans. I just want us to start thinking about how can we make kids more aware of the sensations that come into play when they're doing different activities, and how their sensations are different, and how their needs are different from other kids, and how that's okay, right? Maybe one child really likes to play in a certain sensory bin and another kid doesn't. How can we help them to both play in it? Maybe one kid uses their hands and the other uses a scooper, and helping them to just recognize that, accept it, respect it, and move on. So just make sure that we're being intentional about all of that. But that doesn't mean a big plan, right? The last thing that I want to talk about is too, that we have to keep our own sensory preferences in mind, right? I worked with a family one time that the mom was just very aversive to Play-Doh. She didn't like how it felt. She didn't like how it smelled. Like she literally gagged with Play-Doh. But her kids were very tactile and they really craved that sensory play with Play-Doh. And this can come into play. I bring this up because it can come into play when we're planning sensory activities, right? We might plan activities that really meet our sensory needs or that are very pertinent to our sensory system, and kind of neglect others. So it's important to maybe think about having different teachers plan different sensory activities, and think about how these activities are different too. All right. So the last piece when we're thinking about sensory play every day. So we've talked about acknowledging and bringing that awareness to the different sensory systems. We talked about how to make things intentional. And now we're going to start talking about how do we start creating some language and communication around it. Creating language and communication when it comes to sensory is so important because it kind of acts as that bridge or that transfer of knowledge from a person that understands it to a person that maybe doesn't understand it, or even just really promoting that curiosity when it comes to our different responses. And once we have a better understanding and awareness of our own sensory needs and the child's sensory needs, we can start to create some language around this. Like all communication, the more we communicate with someone with specifics and intention, the more they begin to understand and begin to communicate their own needs as well. So when we're looking at things from a sensory lens, we approach things with that sense of curiosity that we talked about before, right? And I think it's easy to approach things when we're thinking about it from curiosity because we're always trying to kind of understand it better. We're getting at the why, getting at the root of it. So I really wanted to share some of my common or my go-to phrases that I use when it comes to developing sensory language. So I'm going to give a scenario and then kind of an example of the communication that you could use with it. So you see a child covering their ears. That's the scenario. You could approach this with, I wonder if it's too loud in here. So we're teaching them to kind of think about it, to consider it, to figure out, oh, yeah, oh, you're right, it is loud. I don't like all of this noise. And, we could just give them a pair of headphones, right? And that's great too. But if we're communicating about it, we're creating that bridge, that transfer of knowledge so that they're starting to understand, oh, I don't like loud noises, or loud noises bother me, or at this time of the day, loud noises are a lot for me to take in or to handle. Right, so scenario, you notice that a child bumps into a peer and a fight ensues. Language that you could use is, it seems that Harry tripped over this toy and ran into you. So now, instead of that child interpreting that as a threat and feeling that like they need to fight back, they can understand, oh, either I was clumsy or my peer was clumsy. They didn't mean it. It was a mistake. You might also kind of be asking yourself, how is clumsiness sensory but proprioception, that sense of where my body is in space? There's a big sensory component to that too. So be thinking of that. All right, another scenario. Child's running around like a hooligan during morning meeting. I'm sure we can all relate to that. The language that we could give them is, it seems like your body needs movement, but it's not the time for movement right now. So my go-tos are, I wonder, just getting them thinking. It seems, or even just asking those what if, where would, when, or how, those sort of things you can go to. So what if you cover your ears? Does that help? How would it feel if you filled your belly with food? Where would you climb if you were outside? When you plug your nose, does that help? So we're giving language and then also kind of a skill or a tool, or we're supporting them to figure out how do I work through this. We also want to be looking for signs of a mismatch. So mismatches can occur in a few different ways. The first is when a child's reaction doesn't really fit a situation. So you might notice that, for example, I think clumsiness is a great example here, right? So they trip and then they, get upset with their peer, really perceive that as a threat or start to blame them. There's kind of a mismatch there, right? And we can help them to begin to understand that a little bit better. And then also we might create mismatches if we're putting our own sensory preferences onto a child. A lot of times it doesn't seem like those sensory situations fit, right? So I want to give the example of noise. So if a child making a ton of noise, we might think that they like noise. But in fact, a lot of times it's the opposite. They are very sensitive to the noises in their environment, and they're trying to drown those out by creating their own noise. So if they can't filter out the environment noises, they might be creating their own so that it feels comfortable, it's safe, they know what to expect, it can be consistent. So it's easy to kind of misinterpret some of those situations, and I call those mismatches. And then a lot of times we're putting our own sensory preferences on a child, right? Unintentionally, of course. And I think we've probably all heard these things growing up. So a lot of these are probably ingrained, but here's some things that we might say when we're putting our own sensory preferences onto a child. That isn't spicy, just eat it. That's way too much ketchup, put some back. That water isn't cold, now get in. It is way too cold out to wear that, put something else on. Why do you always want to wear that? You aren't wearing that every day. Now go change. So when we're using phrases like that, we are putting our own sensory preferences onto that child and really preventing the opportunity for them to better understand their own specific sensory needs. So now we can tweak this with just a little phrase to make it a little bit more sensory friendly. So I'm going to read some of those to you now. So instead of this isn't spicy, just eat it, we could say this is spicy for you, but it isn't spicy for me. That water feels really cold to you, so I can just add in a little bit of warmer water. You like a lot of ketchup on your food. I like just a dot. For you, it doesn't feel very cold outside. It does feel cold to me. Should we go see what the temperature says? What the temperature is? You feel most comfortable wearing your hood. Wearing a hood doesn't feel very comfortable to me. So by just changing phrases in that little bit, we can help kids to better understand their own sensory system and what that means, and just be able to start communicating that with other people, right? So that is kind of the end of the presentation, the first part of the presentation. So thank you so much for joining me today. I hope that you learned some more about sensory. Bye.